A police captain slammed a black woman against a squad car, barking orders and flexing his power, never realizing he'd just assaulted federal judge Rebecca Washington, the woman who held his entire career in her hands. And in the next 5 minutes, his life would unravel before the nation, caught on cameras that never stopped recording. Before we continue this powerful story, let us know where you're watching from. If you enjoy stories like this, subscribe to the channel, because tomorrow we have another powerful story you won't want to miss. The lights of downtown Atlanta flickered against the night sky as federal judge Rebecca Washington finally stepped out of the towering Richard B. Russell Federal Building. 14 hours, 14 relentless hours in a courtroom wading through the tangled wreckage of a federal racketeering case that had drained the life from her bones. She carried no entourage, no armed escort, just a battered leather briefcase filled with legal files, and a quiet determination that had carried her through decades of systemic resistance. As the heels of her shoes echoed softly against the concrete of the courthouse parking deck, the tension of the day should have begun to slip away, but something felt off. 2 levels below, in a cracked office at the precinct's downtown outpost, Captain Derek Sullivan slammed his palm against a pile of disappointing clearance rate reports. His face burned with frustration. 20 years in the force, and this was how they repaid him. Budget cuts from the mayor's office, public complaints about enough, and whispers of internal affairs sniffing around. To him, policing wasn't about community or constitution, it was about control. Sullivan had built his career on one thing: commanding respect through fear. Tonight was supposed to be a routine operation, a minor drug sweep to satisfy the department's monthly stats. But the only thing his officers had found was paperwork and cold coffee. Then came the call: suspicious activity reported near the federal courthouse. Multiple individuals loitering in the parking structure. Possible narcotics transaction. Sullivan's jaw clenched the second he heard federal. Federal jurisdiction meant paperwork, protocols, and oversight. But to him, it was still his city, his streets, and no judge, no agent, and certainly no civilian was going to tell him how to run it. Rebecca Washington reached her car, a silver Mercedes tucked into the far corner of the staff parking zone. She paused, sensing something below. She adjusted her glasses and peered over the rail. 3 patrol cruisers had boxed in a group of men near the visitor lot. Even from this distance, she could tell they were young, dressed in Lawpore staff lanyards, carrying briefcases and laptops, not street deals. Their body language wasn't threatening, it was exhausted. She sighed softly. She knew the pattern: black and brown bodies, late at night, automatically framed as suspects, even on federal property, even in the shadow of the law itself. Below, Sullivan threw his Ford Explorer into park, slamming the door with force. His officers, Torres, Jackson, and Martinez, already had 4 young black clerks lined up against a cement barrier. Clipboards scattered on the ground, briefcases opened, hands splayed against cool concrete. No weapons, no drugs, no threats. Just federal employees finishing a late night's work. Sullivan didn't care. This wasn't about legality. This was about showing dominance in front of his subordinates. He adjusted his utility belt and strode forward, barking orders before he even knew what they were responding to. And from the shadows of the upper level, Rebecca Washington watched, knowing she had a choice to make: walk away or step into the storm. Rebecca Washington exhaled slowly and made her decision. She locked her car, tucked the briefcase firmly under her arm, and walked steadily toward the lower parking level. Her steps were deliberate, calm, and unhurried, as if descending into a courtroom rather than a confrontation. She wasn't wearing her judicial robes tonight, only a tailored navy blazer and a silver pendant her mother had given her when she passed the bar. But she carried the same authority in her voice as she did from the bench. Down below, the tension was crackling. The young clerks shifted uncomfortably, their backs still to the officers. They knew enough not to move, not to argue. These officers didn't care who they worked for. Sullivan stood a few feet behind his team, arms crossed, scanning the lot like a king surveying his territory. He hadn't noticed her yet, "Excuse me, officers," Rebecca called out, her voice clear and unwavering, cutting cleanly through the night air. "I'm wondering if I could understand the nature of this detention." Heads turned. Officer Torres froze first, his pulse jumping as he registered the voice. Educated, composed, and clearly unafraid. Jackson shifted uneasily, exchanging a glance with Martinez. They knew this wasn't some passerby. Civilians didn't approach like this, didn't speak with that measured control. But Captain Sullivan saw something else entirely. He saw a black woman, mid-40s, briefcase in hand, questioning his authority in front of his men. He didn't hear the composure in her tone. He didn't recognize the warning in her posture. All he saw was someone stepping out of line. "Ma'am," he barked, stepping forward, his boots clapping against the asphalt, "this is police business. You're going to need to move along." Rebecca met his gaze, unblinking. "Captain Sullivan, badge number 2847, she said, her voice calm but edged with unmistakable precision. "This is federal property. I'm asking you, respectfully, for the legal basis of your actions." The use of his badge number hit Sullivan like a slap. How did she know that? Most civilians didn't know how to read rank insignia, let alone recite badge numbers from 30 feet away. But his face hardened, refusing to back down in front of his team. "What I'm doing is making sure this area is secure," Sullivan growled. "You want to question it? You file a complaint at the station. Right now, you need to step away." But Rebecca didn't move. She stood there, still and calm as marble, the hum of the overhead lights buzzing above them. Officer Torres swallowed hard. He could feel it, the shift in the air. This wasn't some protester or passerby. This woman had weight, and Sullivan, in his arrogance, had just missed every sign. Rebecca took one slow step forward, letting the weight of her authority settle over the parking lot. Her voice remained calm, measured, and unmistakably clear. "Captain Sullivan, under federal jurisdiction, this is classified as protected property. I'm advising you to identify the probable cause for this stop immediately." Sullivan's jaw clenched so tight his teeth hurt. He could feel the eyes of his officers on him, waiting to see how he would respond. His pride screamed for dominance. His ego couldn't process the thought of a black woman, a civilian as far as he was concerned, challenging him here in front of his men. But the little voice in the back of his mind, the one trained in academy protocol, whispered that this wasn't going the way it should. He silenced it. "You need to back away right now, ma'am," he barked, taking a step closer. "This is a law enforcement matter. I won't ask you again." Rebecca didn't flinch. Her face remained composed, but her mind catalogued every violation of procedure. Failure to state probable cause, unlawful dissension on federal property, escalation without de-escalation protocol. She had seen this kind of officer before, in case of awe and witness stands, and sadly, far too often, in memorial tributes to the victims who didn't survive. "I'm standing on federal ground," she said softly but firmly. "And these are federal employees leaving their shifts. You are dangerously close to exceeding your jurisdiction, Captain." The word jurisdiction hit Sullivan like a spark to gasoline. In his world, jurisdiction was something people waved around when they were too weak to exert real authority. To him, power wasn't about paperwork or law. Power was about who obeyed when you raised your voice. And right now, she wasn't obeying. He took one final step forward, close enough now to see the steady calm in her eyes, and something inside him snapped. "This is your final warning," Sullivan growled, his voice low and dangerous. "Either walk away, or you're going to find yourself in handcuffs." Rebecca tilted her head slightly, as if studying him for a courtroom deposition. She said nothing at first. Then she spoke, clear and sharp as a gavel strike. "Captain Sullivan, I strongly advise you to contact your supervisor before this situation escalates further." There it was. The lifeline, the exit ramp, the chance to walk away. But Sullivan's pride couldn't take it. Not tonight. Not after everything else he'd lost control over. He looked into her calm, measured face and saw only a challenge. And in that split-second decision, forged from arrogance and blind rage, he prepared to do something that would unravel his entire career. He raised his hand toward his cuffs. And in the quiet hum of the federal courthouse, the night held its breath. Captain Sullivan's hand hovered near his cuffs, his mind a storm of wounded pride and blind arrogance. In that moment, the lessons of restraint, the policies of de-escalation, the years of law enforcement training, none of it mattered. All he saw was defiance. All he felt was rage. And no matter who she was, no matter what rank she claimed to hold, he was going to show her exactly who was in charge. "Last chance," Sullivan barked, his voice sharp and slicing through the humid night air. "Step away from this scene, or you'll be placed under arrest for obstruction." Judge Washington didn't move. She stood there as if rooted to the concrete itself, calm, still, and entirely unmoved by his threats. "Captain, under Title 18 of the United States Code, your jurisdiction does not extend to unlawful detentions on federal property," she replied. "These men are federal clerks, and you are currently operating outside the scope of your lawful authority?" Sullivan's face flushed deep red. Every word she spoke was a direct hit to his pride. He didn't hear the federal statutes. He didn't process the jurisdictional lines she laid out so clearly. All he heard was a black woman telling him no. And that, in his mind, was the one thing he couldn't tolerate. From the side, Officer Torres shifted uncomfortably. He could feel it spiraling out of control. He glanced at Jackson, who gave him a subtle shake of the head. Martinez looked down at his boots, already knowing they were in dangerous territory. None of them had drawn their weapons, but the threat in the air was as heavy as the night heat. They knew Sullivan's temper, and they knew this wouldn't end well. "Captain," Torres tried quietly, his voice barely audible, "maybe we should—" "Enough," Sullivan snapped without even turning his head. "I gave her a lawful order. She refuses to comply. She leaves me no choice." Rebecca watched it happen in slow motion. The tightening of his jaw, the tension in his shoulders, the reckless certainty of a man who had gone unchecked for far too long. She'd seen it before, in courtroom testimony, in battered witnesses, in case files filled with broken lives, men who thought their badge made them invincible, men who mistook their authority for absolute power. She took a breath, calm, centered. "Captain Sullivan, I advise you one last time. This is federal ground, and your actions will carry federal consequences." But it was too late. The decision had been made. With a growl of frustration, Sullivan lunged forward, reaching for her arm. And in that single, reckless moment, he crossed a line he could never uncross. Sullivan's hand clamped down on Judge Washington's left arm with brutal force, fingers digging deep into muscle and bone. Without hesitation, he spun her around and shoved her backward against the cold, unyielding metal of his patrol car. The briefcase slipped from her grasp and hit the asphalt with a hollow thud, its metal clasp snapping open on impact. Legal documents exploded onto the ground like a burst of windblown leaves, sealed case files, federal court orders, confidential motions bearing the seal of the United States District Court, papers detailing corruption cases, civil rights violations, and law enforcement misconduct scattered beneath the harsh glow of the overhead lights. But Sullivan didn't notice. He couldn't see past his own anger. "Put your hands behind your back," he roared, pressing his knee into the small of her back with a force that betrayed his simmering rage. Rebecca winced slightly but kept her voice steady, clear, and calm. "Captain Sullivan, you are violating 18 U.S.C. 242. You are depriving a United States citizen of their constitutional rights under color of law. This is a federal offense." The words should have stopped him, should have made him hesitate, but Sullivan was far beyond reason now. "You think quoting some law book is going to stop me?" he sneered. "You'll learn real quick who's in charge out here." From a few feet away, Officer Torres felt his stomach drop. He watched the federal documents flutter across the asphalt, recognizing the seals, the headings, the significance. These weren't the random files of some troublemaker. These were official federal case files, documents no civilian would carry. Jackson took an involuntary step backward, his hand moving away from his holster as the gravity of the situation hit him. Martinez exchanged a wide-eyed glance with Torres, both of them silently realizing the same terrible truth. This wasn't a civilian. This wasn't some nosy bystander or activist. This was someone who had power, real power. And Captain Sullivan had just physically assaulted her on federal property. Torres opened his mouth to speak again, to warn him, but the words caught in his throat. Because in that moment, he saw the courthouse security camera mounted above the lot, its red recording light blinking steadily. Recording every second, capturing every word, bearing silent witness to a career-emptying mistake that no amount of spin could erase. And the woman pressed against the patrol car, still calm, still unbroken, spoke once more with a quiet finality that chilled them all. "Captain Sullivan, my name is Federal Judge Rebecca Washington, and you have just made the gravest mistake of your life." The name hit the air like a thunderclap. For a full second, there was only silence, thick, suffocating, undeniable. Then the reality of what Sullivan had done began to settle in, suffocating the parking lot like fog rolling across the asphalt. Torres froze completely. His heart pounded against his ribs, panic flooding his chest. He knew that name. Everyone in Georgia law enforcement knew that name, Federal Judge Rebecca Washington. The judge who presided over civil rights cases, police misconduct trials, and high-profile corruption prosecutions. The one judge no officer in their right mind would ever cross. And Captain Sullivan had just manhandled her like some street corner suspect. Officer Jackson took 2 slow steps back, wiping a nervous hand across his brow. His stomach turned cold. He thought about his own badge, his pension, his family. What he had just witnessed could end them all. Martinez's fingers trembled slightly at his sides. His body camera was still rolling, still recording, capturing every second of Sullivan's assault. He realized in horror that his footage would soon be played in federal court, on national television, on news broadcasts across the country. But Captain Sullivan remained blind, deaf, and lost in his own arrogance. He scoffed, tightening his grip on Washington's wrist. "Federal judge? Yeah, right. You expect me to believe that? Out here? Dressed like that? What kind of judge walks around interfering with police work?" Rebecca remained perfectly still beneath his grip, refusing to give him the satisfaction of struggle. Her voice was steady, precise. "I carry myself wherever I go, Captain. I don't need robes to know who I am. But you needed to know who I was before you laid a hand on me. Now, it's too late." Above them, the security camera's red light blinked, silent but unblinking, recording a moment that would be played back across courtrooms and television screens for years to come. And somewhere beyond the parking lot, courthouse security officers were already mobilizing. Their radios crackled to life as federal protective protocols kicked in. The assault of a federal judge was one of the fastest triggers for emergency response in federal law enforcement. Within moments, backup was on the way. But on this lot, beneath the harsh artificial light, Sullivan still believed he had the upper hand. In his mind, titles were meaningless. Paperwork was a nuisance, and power was measured by who could be forced to submit. But what Sullivan didn't understand, what he refused to see, was that the ground beneath his feet was already collapsing. And the men standing beside him, Torres, Jackson, Martinelli, they knew Iser. They knew their careers, their futures, their entire department was now spiraling toward disaster. And there was no stopping it. Because Sullivan hadn't just crossed a line tonight. He had shattered it, on camera, in public, against a federal judge who knew exactly how to dismantle him, piece by piece. And the night was only beginning. The first sound was distant, low, mechanical and steady, tires screeching across concrete. Then, in the blink of an eye, the entire parking lot exploded with flashing blue and red lights. 3 black SUVs with federal plates tore into the lot from opposite entrances, their tires skidding as they boxed in Sullivan's squad car. Doors flew open, and federal agents in tactical gear fanned out in synchronized precision, weapons drawn but angled down. Captain Sullivan froze mid-motion, still gripping Judge Washington's wrist. He stared in disbelief as half a dozen federal agents advanced, their body armor glinting under the harsh fluorescent lights. These weren't local officers. These weren't deputies from the sheriff's office. These were federal agents, the kind that didn't answer to him, didn't take his rules. A woman stepped forward from the lead SUV, her voice calm but cutting like steel. "Captain Derek Sullivan, release her now." Her badge gleamed under the lights, United States Marshals Service, and beneath it, her nameplate read, Santos. Special Agent Maria Santos had spent her career leading federal courthouse security across the Southern District. She knew every judge by name, every threat protocol by heart, and every line of jurisdiction like scripture. And right now, she wasn't asking, "Captain, you are physically detaining a sitting federal judge on protected federal property. You will release her immediately and step back from the vehicle." Her voice was measured, unmistakable, and recorded by the body cameras worn by every federal agent on scene. Sullivan blinked, struggling to process the impossible. His grip loosened, and Rebecca Washington straightened slowly, adjusting her jacket with quiet composure. She didn't look at him. She didn't need to. Her very presence was enough to erase any illusion of power he thought he held. Behind him, Torres, Jackson, and Martinez stood frozen, their faces drained of color. This was no longer a stop-and-shamoose gone wrong. This was a federal incident, and they were all standing in the blast zone. Santos spoke again, sharper this time. "Captain Sullivan, step away from the judge and identify yourself." Sullivan stumbled back, raising his hands slightly, his mind scrambling for control of the situation he no longer owned. "She interfered with a police investigation. I gave her lawful orders." "Silence," Santos snapped, her voice slicing through his excuses. "You just assaulted federal judge Rebecca Washington." The words hit like a hammer blow to the chest, and for the first time that night, Sullivan's face registered what he had truly done. Sullivan's mouth opened, but no words came out. The title alone, federal judge, sucked the air from his lungs. It wasn't just the rank. It wasn't just the authority. It was the federal crime he had committed with half a dozen witnesses and multiple surveillance cameras recording every second. Officer Torres felt his knees go weak. He glanced around, looking for any escape, but there was none. This wasn't a bad call. This wasn't a write-up. This was the kind of mistake that ended careers, destroyed families, and made national headlines before sunrise. He could already hear the echo of reporters shouting Sullivan's name on the morning news. Jackson wiped his sweaty palms on his pants, his mind racing through every disciplinary hearing he'd ever sat through. Nothing had ever come close to this. Assaulting a federal judge wasn't something you explained away in a memo. It wasn't something the union could protect you from. It was a federal crime, punishable by years behind bars. Martinez glanced at his body cam. The little green light was still blinking steadily, recording it all. He wanted to turn it off. Every instinct screamed to stop the footage, to bury what they'd just witnessed. But it was too late. It was already saved to the cloud, already archived in federal servers far beyond his reach. Special Agent Santos took a slow step forward, her voice steady but deadly serious. "Captain Sullivan, by federal statute, any use of force against a sitting federal judge is a violation of 18 U.S.C. 111 and 18 U.S.C. 242. You understand the gravity of what you've done." Sullivan tried to steady himself, but his hands shook. For the first time in years, he felt powerless. His badge, his rank, his command, all worthless in the face of federal authority. He gave a slight nod, but Santos wasn't finished. "You will not remain on scene. You will not leave, communicate with your department, or tamper with any evidence. Federal Protective Service is taking jurisdiction of this crime scene." Those words stripped the last illusion of control from Sullivan's mind. Jurisdiction had shifted. He wasn't in charge anymore, and no matter how loud he barked or how hard he fought, there was no getting it back. Behind them, courthouse security staff began roping off the parking lot. Yellow federal crime scene tape stretched across the entrance, sealing the lot from the outside world. Flashing lights painted the asphalt in harsh, cold colors. And from the shadows, more federal agents emerged, quiet and efficient, already documenting the scene that would soon shake the entire city. The storm had arrived, and Sullivan was standing at the center of it. Across the street, behind the thick glass windows of the federal building, red warning lights began to pulse silently. Inside the security command center, monitors displayed multiple camera angles of the scene unfolding in the parking lot below. Courthouse Security Chief Robert Hanley leaned in, his face tight with concern. "Activate Protocol FPS 2847, he ordered. That single command triggered a series of actions that no local police force could stop. Within moments, notifications flashed across the systems of the Federal Protective Service, the Department of Justice Civil Rights Division, and the U.S. Marshals. Automated alerts were already being transmitted to Washington, D.C., informing senior officials that a federal judge had been assaulted on government property by a select law enforcement officer. There was no putting the genie back in the bottle now. Down in the lot, Judge Washington remained calm, straightening her jacket with the quiet dignity that had carried her through years of hostile courtrooms. She gathered her scattered legal files from the ground, each page a testament to the federal cases she was overseeing. Cases that, ironically, involved corrupt law enforcement officers, much like Sullivan himself. Special Agent Santos approached her with visible respect. "Your Honor, we've activated emergency protocols. Are you injured?" Rebecca shook her head gently, her voice steady. "No injuries, Agent Santos, but I'll need copies of the surveillance footage from cameras 7, 12, and 15. I'll also require the preliminary incident report filed within the hour. And please ensure that this scene remains secured under federal jurisdiction." Santos nodded without hesitation. "Yes, ma'am, already underway." Behind them, Sullivan stood frozen, his authority reduced to nothing but a crumbling badge on his chest. His mind raced with futile thoughts of damage control, but deep down, he knew there would be no saving this. He looked to his officers for support, but none of them moved. Torres stared at the ground, Jackson kept his arms crossed tightly, and Martinez avoided his gaze entirely. The thin blue line that had protected him for 2 decades had vanished in an instant. And then the final blow came. Santos spoke into her radio, her voice clear and precise. "Notify FBA Atlanta Field Office and Civil Rights Division. Officer involved assault on federal judge confirmed. Full investigation protocol activated. Initiate automatic DOJ oversight review." Those words sealed it. The FBI, the DOJ, full oversight review. Sullivan felt the ground drop beneath his feet. These weren't his supervisors, his union reps, or his political allies. These were federal agencies that owed him nothing and saw his badge not as protection, but as evidence. And above them, in the cold night sky, the courthouse security cameras recorded every second. The footage would be downloaded, duplicated, and archived in secure federal databases before Sullivan's department even knew what hit them. By the time the mayor's office woke up to the scandal, the FBI would already be drafting subpoenas, and the Department of Justice would be preparing to dismantle everything Sullivan thought he controlled. In a matter of minutes, one man's arrogance had become a federal disaster. And the reckoning had only just begun. Special Agent Maria Santos stood with her tablet in hand, her fingers flying across the screen as she began assembling the preliminary incident report. Her voice remained calm, steady, and professional, but the gravity of her words was unmistakable. In the cool night air of the courthouse parking lot, she recited the charges aloud so there would be no confusion, no denial later. "Captain Derek Sullivan," she began, her tone sharp, "is in violation of 18 U.S. Code SS 111, assaulting a federal officer in 18 U.S. Code SS 242, deprivation of rights under color of law." The officer standing nearby froze as those statutes echoed across the parking lot. These weren't misdemeanors. These weren't detrimental violations. These were federal crimes that carried prison sentences, public disgrace, and permanent removal from law enforcement. Judge Washington adjusted her glasses, her voice cool as glass. "You may also wish to include 18 U.S. Code SS 245 for interference with federally protected activities. Captain Sullivan forcibly detained me while I was performing my judicial duties. That statute applies here, Agent Santos." Agent Santos gave a brief nod, adding the charge without hesitation. Captain Sullivan's chest rose and fell rapidly, his bravado crumbling under the weight of the charges stacking against him. He opened his mouth to protest but found no words. Nothing he could say would change the reality he now faced. From the sidelines, Officer Torres whispered to Martinez, his voice shaking, "We just watched our captain commit a federal crime." Martinez said nothing. His eyes locked on Sullivan, seeing his commanding officer not as the unshakable leader they had followed for years, but as a man unraveling by his own arrogance. Torres took a slow, trembling breath. There's no way out of this. No spin, no cover-up. He assaulted a federal judge on federal property. Cameras caught everything. We're done. Martinez nodded, his throat dry. Further away, Jackson stared blankly at the horizon, his mind already racing. He could feel his career slipping away. In his pocket, his phone vibrated. A news alert popped up. The first local outlet had caught wind of an incident outside the courthouse. No names yet, but it wouldn't be long. Jackson opened his email app and started drafting a resignation letter in his head. He wasn't sure if it was to save his pension, his reputation, or simply to sleep at night. But the writing was on the wall. And in the middle of it all, Captain Sullivan stood silent, surrounded by agents, his authority evaporating by the second. Judge Washington crossed her arms gently, her voice low but unwavering. "Captain, you've spent your career teaching others that power is taken, not earned. Tonight you learned how fragile that power really is." Across town, in a quiet subdivision where the streetlights barely cut through the night fog, Lieutenant Commander James Morrison was pulled from a restless sleep by the shrill ringing of his work phone. He groaned, rolled over, and checked the caller ID. It wasn't Sullivan. It wasn't the night sergeant. It was a number he didn't recognize. He answered, his voice rough. "Morrison?" The voice on the other end was cold, efficient. "Lieutenant Commander Morrison, this is Special Agent Santos with the United States Marshals Service. You need to be informed that Captain Derek Sullivan has physically assaulted Federal Judge Rebecca Washington in the parking lot of the Richard B. Russell Federal Courthouse. Federal charges are pending." Morrison sat up straight, suddenly wide awake. "I'm sorry, who?" "Federal Judge Rebecca Washington," Santos repeated, her tone leaving no room for misunderstanding. Morrison's heart slammed against his ribs. He swung his legs over the side of the bed, rubbing a hand across his face. Of all the people Sullivan could have crossed paths with tonight, it had to be her, the one judge who had the authority, the influence, and the federal reach to bring their entire department under scrutiny. "Is it?" Morrison asked, though he already knew the answer. Cameras recorded everything. "Multiple federal agencies are en route. I suggest you notify your legal counsel immediately." The call ended, leaving Morrison staring at the darkness of his bedroom. He reached for the glass of water on his nightstand, but his hand shook so badly that he spilled half of it. For years, Morrison had protected Sullivan. He had turned a blind eye to the complaints, shielded him from internal investigations, and swept dozens of excessive force claims under the rug. He thought he was preserving stability in the department. In truth, he had been building a bomb, and tonight, Sullivan lit the fuse. He knew what was coming next. This wasn't going to stop with Sullivan. The DOA would dig deeper. They'd subpoena personnel files, review body camera footage, audit complaint histories. They'd uncover everything Morrison thought he had buried. Every complaint dismissed without follow-up. Every victim who'd been paid off in silence. Every officer whose misconduct had been handled internally. And they wouldn't just take down Sullivan, they'd take down the network that had protected him for 2 decades. Morrison sat in the dark, hearing the faint hum of his wife's breathing beside him. He didn't wake her. How could he explain that by morning his name might be on the same list as Sullivan's? He had one option left: call the chief. Try to contain the fallout before it burned down the entire department. But deep down, he knew it was already too late. In the parking lot, the tension shifted from confrontation to cold, clinical procedure. Special Agent Santos signaled her team. They began photographing the scene from multiple angles. Sullivan's squad car, the scattered legal documents, and the positioning of every officer present. Every frame told the story of what had just happened, and this time, there would be no missing footage, no corrupted files, no reports lost in bureaucratic confusion. Rebecca Washington quietly gathered her case files, piece by piece, her hands steady despite the storm around her. Each document bore the federal seal, some containing sensitive details from cases Sullivan and his department had tried to avoid. She didn't speak to him again. There was nothing left to say. Torres watched her, his heart sinking deeper with each passing second. He knew what was coming. Federal charges weren't rumors. They weren't departmental reviews that could be tossed down at Monday morning staff meetings. They were career sinecures, life changers, and for the first time, Torres questioned his own choices. Had he stayed silent too long? Had he enabled this? The questions gnawed at him, cold and relentless. Martinez shifted beside him, his body stiff with dread. He replayed the night's events over and over in his mind, wishing for a moment, any moment, where he could spoken up sooner. But the truth was simple. None of them had stopped Sullivan. They had let him take it too far. Jackson couldn't take it anymore. He stepped back from the group, pulling out his phone. His regulation draft stared back at him. He didn't hit send yet, but he read it again and again, knowing it was only a matter of time. Sullivan stood silent, watching as everything he had built crumbled before his eyes. For years, he had believed he was untouchable. His connections, his seniority, his political favors, they had shielded him from every consequence. But standing in that federal lot, under those harsh white lights, with Judge Washington's quiet defiance burning into his memory, he realized none of it mattered anymore. Santos approached him one final time, her voice low but final. "Captain Sullivan, you will remain here until the Federal Protective Service completes its documentation. Afterward, you will be relieved of duty pending investigation. Do not attempt to leave the premises. Do not communicate with your department. This is no longer your jurisdiction." She turned away before he could answer. Because in truth, there was no answer that could undo what he had done. Across the city, Morrison paced his kitchen, phone pressed to his ear. He had already briefed the chief, who sat in stunned silence as Morrison laid out the facts. And now, he was waiting for the mayor to call, waiting for internal affairs to respond, waiting for the first wave of media reports to break the story wide open. Because they both knew this was only the beginning. Within hours, subpoenas would be issued. The DOJ would launch a formal investigation, and every complaint Morrison had buried, every piece of misconduct he had minimized, would be dragged into the light. And when the sun rose over Atlanta, nothing would ever be the same. The first black SUV pulled up before dawn, headlights cutting across the fog-draped courthouse steps. FBI Special Agent Jennifer Walsh stepped out, her coat trailing behind her, a folder already in hand. She wasn't here for negotiations. She was here for the truth. By the time the sun rose over Atlanta, the mobile forensic unit was fully operational. FBI tech teams spread across the courthouse and the police department's downtown precinct, downloading body cam footage, pulling dispatch logs, and requesting immediate access to personnel files. Every keystroke brought them closer to unraveling the full scope of Derek Sullivan's misconduct. Special Agent Walsh stood beside Agent Santos in the parking lot, reviewing the preliminary crime scene report. What started as a single assault was quickly expanding into something much larger. The background checks on Sullivan's career sent red flags flying in every direction. Dozens of complaints closed without resolution. Exorcists investigations that had vanished without explanation. Settlements paid out quietly, far from the public eye. "Look at this," Walsh muttered, scrolling through a case summary. 8 complaints of unlawful detention dismissed in a single year. That's not negligence, that's protection. Santos nodded grimly. Internal affairs? Walsh pulled up the IA records, all handled by the same officer, Lieutenant Michael Foster. Every investigation closed as unsubstantiated. Not one referred to the DA, not one escalated to the Civilian Oversight Board. This isn't a coincidence. This is a cover-up. Across town, Lieutenant Foster sat alone in his office, bathed in the pale glow of his computer screen. Word of the courthouse disaster had reached him before sunrise. He knew the questions would start by mid-morning. He knew the federal subpoenas wouldn't be far behind. For years, Foster had protected Sullivan, closing cases quietly, massaging reports, and dismissing credible complaints. He thought he was playing the game, preserving the department's image, keeping the city council off their backs, shielding their officers from what he called public overreaction. But now, that game was over. He opened his email and began erasing correspondence. He deleted text threads, wiped archived notes, and shredded old reports. But deep down, he knew it wouldn't be enough. Federal forensics didn't rely on what you tried to hide. They knew where to look. Meanwhile, Morrison was on damage control, holding emergency meetings with the chief of police and city attorneys. But every plan they put on the table fell apart as new evidence surfaced. Dispatch logs showed patterns of harassment in black neighborhoods. Body cams revealed repeated stops without probable cause. Civilian complaints, once dismissed as unsubstantiated, now read like a roadmap to systemic abuse. And hanging over them all was the one truth Morrison couldn't deny. This wasn't about Sullivan alone. This was the system finally being exposed. Lieutenant Foster's phone rang at 6:42 a.m. sharp. He stared at the caller ID, Internal Affairs Regional Oversight Division, and for a fleeting second, he considered letting it ring. But he knew better. With a sigh that felt like a lifetime of weight crashing down, he answered. "Lieutenant Foster," the voice on the other end said crisply. "We've been advised by the Federal Protective Service to secure all internal investigations related to Captain Derek Sullivan immediately. Please prepare full transcripts, audio recordings, and written summaries of every excessive force complaint filed over the past 10 years. Foster gripped the phone tighter. His mouth went dry. "Understood," he said, but what he really meant was, "It's already over." At police headquarters, Morrison sat in a conference room surrounded by senior staff, their faces pale and hollow. Half the department still didn't know what had happened overnight. They thought Sullivan had made a bad arrest, a misunderstanding maybe. But Morrison knew. He'd seen this before. Officers thinking they were untouchable until the federal government came knocking. "Do we have time to prepare a press release?" one deputy chief asked. Morrison shook his head, the lines in his face deeper than ever before. "It won't matter. The feds will release the surveillance footage. And once the media sees who he laid hands on, they won't care what we say. The narrative's already written." The chief of police slammed his fist on the table. "We're talking about Derek Sullivan. 20 years of service. Half our leadership pipeline came up under him. If they go after him, they'll come for all of us." Morrison's voice was low, steady, and bitter. "They already are." While command staff argued about damage control, the FBI's forensic unit quietly pulled Sullivan's personnel file. His career timeline lit up like a crime scene. Dozens of incidents, reviewed by the same internal affairs officer, foster complaints withdrawn after initial filing, witnesses who stopped cooperating without explanation, legal settlements paid from discretionary funds that were never disclosed in annual reports. Agent Walsh didn't flinch. She'd seen it all before. She compiled the findings into a preliminary pattern of practice memo, crimming the next stage, a full-smedding MARB reversing the Civil Rights Division investigation. Across downtown, newsrooms stirred to life. Reporters scanned police blotters, courthouse incident logs, and early morning scanner chatter. At first, they called it a federal judge's involvement surfaced. Then, whispers of a federal judge's involvement surfaced. By 7:30 a.m., the headlines read, "High-ranking officer detains black woman at courthouse. Identity revealed as federal judge." But no one, yet, understood how deep this story would go. Because by the time the truth came out, Sullivan's arrest wouldn't be the biggest scandal. The entire department would be. By mid-morning, the story broke wide open. CNN led with the headline, "Federal Judge Assaulted by Local Police Captain in Courthouse Largely Minutes Moderates." Menon's banner that read, "DOJ Confirms Federal Investigation into Georgia Police Department." And by noon, the Washington Post published the first in-depth piece, naming Judge Rebecca Washington and detailing her career-long fight against police corruption. The article didn't just cover the incident, it exposed the context, dozens of unchecked rise, the dozens of buried by internal affairs, and the city's history of shielding bad cops behind layers of bureaucracy. For Lieutenant Commander Morrison, the media frenzy hit like a tidal wave. His phone rang non-stop. Reporters, city council members, the mayor's office, and panicked department heads, all demanding answers he didn't have. He sat at his desk, watching Sullivan's face appear on every news channel, knowing there was no spinning this. It was already out of their hands. Even the union, normally quick to defend officers no matter the circumstance, issued a cautious statement. The allegations against Captain Sullivan are deeply concerning and, if confirmed, represent a serious breach of public trust. Morrison knew what that meant. The union was distancing itself, leaving Sullivan to burn alone. Inside the federal courthouse, Agent Walsh briefed Judge Washington in a quiet, secured conference room. The investigation was moving faster than anyone anticipated. Federal subpoenas were already drafted for Sullivan's communications, Foster's internal affairs records, and Morrison's command logs. "Your Honor," Walsh said carefully, "we've identified at least 7 other officers whose complaint histories mirror Sullivan's. This isn't isolated misconduct. It's a system of protection." Rebecca Washington's gaze was steady. "Then we take down the system, every piece of it." Meanwhile, back at precinct headquarters, younger officers gathered in break rooms and parking garages, whispering about what they'd seen on the morning news. Some were angry, blaming the judge for making a public scene. Others were terrified, realizing that if the feds dug deep enough, more careers would fall. And in a quiet corner of the building, Officer Torres sat alone, scrolling through news articles on his phone. His stomach churned with guilt. He had watched it happen. He had frozen when he should have spoken. Now it was too late. He opened his notes app and began drafting a statement, not to protect Sullivan, not to protect himself, but to finally tell the truth. Because somewhere deep down, Torres knew what Judge Washington had shown them all. Power built on silence was no power at all. And now, with the whole country watching, silence was no longer an option. The first cracks in the department's armor had been exposed, but the collapse, swift, public, and unstoppable, was only beginning. And in the distance, federal prosecutors were sharpening their knives, ready to cut straight to the rotten core of a system that thought it could stand above the law. By mid-morning, the walls finally closed in. Lieutenant Commander Morrison, his face ashen and voice tight with exhaustion, stood in the federal courthouse conference room, surrounded by agents and department attorneys. There was no debate left, no spinning what had happened. The Department of Justice had made it clear Captain Derek Sullivan was no longer fit to wear the badge. Effective immediately, Captain Sullivan is relieved of duty pending the results of the federal investigation, Morrison announced, his voice cracking slightly as he read the statement aloud. He is to surrender his department-issued firearm, badge, and crenessence. He is not to contact any member of this department until further notice. Sullivan stood there, numb. His hands trembled as he removed his badge, the very symbol of his identity for the past 20 years. He laid it on the table alongside his service weapon, the metallic clink echoing through the silent room. He tried to form words, some excuse, some explanation, but nothing came. Special Agent Santos stood nearby, arms crossed, her expression unreadable. "Captain, you will remain on federal property until further notice. Transportation to your residence will be provided, but you are not permitted to leave the state without authorization from the DOJ." The humiliation was complete. Escorted by 2 federal agents, Sullivan walked out of the courthouse he once stormed through with arrogance. Reporters lined the sidewalk, cameras flashing, microphones thrust forward, their voices overlapping in a chaotic blur. "Captain Sullivan, do you have anything to say about the charges? Did you know she was a federal judge when you assaulted her? Will you resign from the department?" Sullivan said nothing. The only sound was the clicking of camera shutters and the buzz of his own crumbling thoughts. At police headquarters, the ripple effect was immediate. Officers removed Sullivan's nameplate from the department's leadership board. His office was sealed for evidence collection, and rumors flew through every hallway. Some whispered that Sullivan would beat the charges like he always did. Others weren't so sure. This wasn't a city council hearing or a disciplinary review. This was federal, and it wasn't just Sullivan under scrutiny anymore. Across town, FBI agents continued pulling case files, each one revealing another piece of the puzzle. Complaints dating back to 2003, all with eerily similar phrasing. Use of force justified. Complaint withdrawn. No corroborating witness testimony. But the pattern was impossible to ignore. Hundreds of complaints, buried in closed filing cabinets. Lawsuits settled quietly out of court with non-disclosure agreements. Witnesses who'd been threatened, intimidated, or mysteriously relocated before their court dates. The deeper the agents dug, the more Sullivan's empire of protection unraveled. And at the center of it all was the harsh truth Morrison could no longer deny. This wasn't just about a rogue officer. This was about a system that had protected him for 2 decades. Inside the federal courthouse, Special Agent Jennifer Walsh compiled her team's findings into a preliminary report. What began as a single assault investigation had ballooned into the largest corruption probe Atlanta had seen in decades. The numbers were staggering. Nearly 200 excessive force complaints never forwarded to prosecutors, dozens of body camera files mysteriously missing, and over 30 internal affairs cases closed without review. But it was the financial trail that confirmed everything. The FBI's forensic accountants uncovered quiet settlements paid out from a discretionary fund buried deep within the city's budget. Settlements paid not by the police department's legal division, but by shadow accounts Morrison had personally approved. Every payment had been labeled as community outreach or risk mitigation, but in reality, it was hush money to silence the victims. Walsh turned to Santos, her voice sharp. "This isn't misconduct. This is organized corruption. We've got conspiracy, obstruction of justice, and deprivation of rights under color of law. This is bigger than Sullivan." Santos nodded grimly. "It always was." Across town, Morrison sat alone in his office, staring at the phone. He knew it wouldn't be long before the call came from Washington. The DOJ would place the entire department under federal oversight. He could already picture the headlines: Atlanta Police Department placed under federal receivership following corruption, blow. His legacy, 25 years of service, reduced to an asterisk in history. He leaned back in his chair, exhausted. He had tried to protect the department from bad press, tried to maintain public trust. But somewhere along the way, protecting the department had turned into protecting the wrong people. And now the system he thought he controlled was collapsing beneath him. In the community, word spread fast. Civil rights leaders, who had fought for years to expose the department's abuses, began organizing press conferences and rallies. Reverend Daniel Price, a longtime activist, stood before a crowd on the courthouse steps, his voice echoing through the streets. This is not the fall of one man. This is the fall of a system that protected men like him. For 20 years, we cried out for justice. For 20 years, they told us it was in our heads. Tonight, they know the truth. News outlets amplified his words, and soon the story wasn't just about Sullivan. It was about every victim who had never seen justice. And in the center of that storm stood Judge Rebecca Washington, preparing for a public statement that would ignite the next chapter of the fight. She knew the cameras were waiting. She knew her words would carry weight. But more than anything, she knew this moment wasn't about her. It was about every person who had been silenced before her. That afternoon, under the heavy gray skies outside the Richard B. Russell Federal Building, Judge Rebecca Washington stepped in front of a sea of microphone. Her face was calm, her voice steady, but the weight of the moment pressed into every syllable. This was no longer a courthouse dispute. It was a national reckoning. "I did not come here today as a victim," she began, her voice clear and unwavering. "I stand before you as a witness to what happens when a system designed to protect the innocent instead shield the powerful. What happened to me last night was not an isolated incident. It was the symptom of a culture that has allowed this kind of abuse to go unchecked for decades." Her words rippled across the crowd. Civil rights leaders nodded silently. Reporters scribbled notes furiously. And across the nation, televisions flickered with her image, carrying her words into homes that had long grown numb to these stories. Until now? "This is not about one officer," she continued. "This is about every officer who looked away, every supervisor who buried a complaint, every politician who prioritized silence over accountability. This is about a system that failed to listen until the violence found its way to a federal judge." Behind her, Agent Walsh and Agent Santos stood silently, their faces betraying no emotion. But they knew the truth of what she spoke. They had spent the last 12 hours piecing together the broken trail of lives left behind by Sullivan's unchecked power. Judge Washington paused, then lowered her voice, allowing the weight of her next words to land. "Let me be clear. This will not end with my story. The federal investigation will continue. Every hidden file, every silenced voice, every abuse of power, we will find them, and we will dismantle the system that allowed them to exist." A quiet hush fell over the plaza. Then, slowly, from the back of the crowd, a pause began to build, soft at first, then louder, until it swept across the courthouse steps like a wave breaking against stone. Leaders from the NAACP, the Southern Poverty Law Center, and dozens of grassroots organizations stepped forward, pledging their support. They knew this was their moment too. They had marched, testified, and protested for years, and now, standing beside a federal judge who carried their truth into the national spotlight, they saw the chance for something greater, real change. But even as the press conference ended, the work was just beginning. Federal agents continued to sift through decades of rot, uncovering a web of corruption so vast that it reached beyond the police department, into city contracts, political donations, and courthouse back rooms, where justice had been sold to the highest bidder. For Sullivan, the collapse was total. His name stripped from the department's honor rolls, his commendations revoked, his pension frozen. The empire he thought he controlled reduced to evidence in a growing federal case file. And for Morrison, the clock was ticking. He knew the subpoenas bearing his name were already on their way. But for the first time in years, the people of Atlanta stood in front of that courthouse, not in fear, but in hope. Because one judge's refusal to be silenced had turned a moment of injustice into a movement of accountability. The federal indictment dropped like a thunderclap at noon. The United States District Court for the Northern District of Georgia released a 147-page indictment outlining a sweeping list of charges against Captain Derek Sullivan, Lieutenant Michael Foster, and Lieutenant Commander James Morrison. The charges were staggering in their breadth: conspiracy to violate civil rights under 18 U.C. Cis 241, deprivation of rights under color of law under 18 U.C. Cis 242, obstruction of justice, witness tampering, and, perhaps most damning of all, violations of the federal hate crime statute 18 U.C. Cis 249 for knowingly targeting black citizens in a pattern of racially motivated abuse. The indictment read like the obituary of a corrupt empire. It laid out a 20-minute scheme where complaints were buried, victims were silenced, and accountability was treated as an inconvenience. Federal prosecutors detailed how Foster's Internal Affairs Office had systematically closed excessive force complaints without follow-up. Morrison had signed off on financial settlements to prevent lawsuits from going public. And Sullivan? He had been the enforcer, the blunt instrument used to terrorize communities while his supervisors covered his tracks. At the press conference announcing the charges, Assistant U.S. Attorney Michael Torres spoke with quiet intensity. This is not simply a case of one officer gone rogue. This is a criminal enterprise that existed within the structure of law enforcement, violating the very Constitution they swore to uphold. Reporters in the room sat in stunned silence. Because this wasn't just about the assault of Judge Washington. It was about every victim who never saw justice. Back in his suburban home, Sullivan sat alone at his kitchen table as the news played on every channel. His face stared back at him from the screen, beneath headlines that read, "Police Captain Indicted on Federal Hate Crime Charges." He tried to steady his hands, but they wouldn't stop shaking. In the next room, his wife Linda was packing boxes. She didn't speak. She didn't have to. After 20 years of standing beside him, defending his decisions and enduring the rumors, she was done. She left the divorce papers on the kitchen counter without a word. And when the front door closed behind her, the silence that followed was deafening. But Sullivan's isolation was just beginning. By the end of the week, his pension was formally frozen under federal forfeiture proceedings. The retirement fund he had spent his entire career building was now flagged as potential proceeds from a criminal conspiracy. The financial safety net he once counted on to carry him through his later years was gone, evaporated in a sea of legal red tape. Then came the most painful blow of all. His two children, both in college, filed paperwork to legally change their last names. They no longer wanted to be associated with the man they once called father. On social media, they issued brief statements: "We condemn our father's actions and stand with the victims," whose voices were silenced for far too long. Sullivan read those words in the quiet of his now empty home, the television flickering silently in the corner. His legacy, the life he thought he had built with strength and authority, had collapsed, and the only thing left standing was the truth he'd spent 2 decades trying to bury. But outside the confines of his home, the ripple effects of the indictment were shaking the entire city. The Department of Justice formally announced a pattern and practice investigation under 42 U.S. CSS 1400, 141, targeting the Atlantic Police Department's systemic civil rights violations. Federal investigators began reviewing thousands of arrest records, use of force reports, and internal disciplinary files. Their findings would determine whether the entire department would be placed under federal oversight, a process that could take years and cost the city millions. 17 additional officers, all named in various complaints, now resurfacing under federal review, were placed on immediate administrative leave. Some were Sullivan's protégés. Others were Foster's trusted enforcers. A few were simply unlucky enough to have been present during incidents they thought would stay buried forever. The department's command staff scrambled to respond, issuing statements promising full cooperation with federal authorities, while quietly preparing their own legal defenses. But behind closed doors, panic spread. No one knew how deep the investigation would go or who would be next. And across Atlanta, communities long ignored by those in power began to gather in church basements, community centers, and courthouse steps. They weren't just celebrating Sullivan's fall. They were organizing, preparing to demand something the city had denied them for generations. Justice that couldn't be buried, accountability that couldn't be silenced, and truth that wouldn't fade when the cameras leapt. The headlines spread far beyond Georgia. National outlets picked up the story with relentless force. The New York Times called it the most consequential federal civil rights case against a police department in the South since the 1960s. The Guardian described it as a dismantling of systemic injustice, brick by brick. And black-letter media outlets spoke the truth that resonated across the country. This is what happens when arrogance meets accountability. But even as the world watched, inside Atlanta, the fractures kept widening. The mayor's office convened an emergency session with the city council, debating how to stabilize a police department now in freefall. Council members who had once protected Sullivan's budget allocations now distanced themselves, calling for immediate reform. Political alliances shifted overnight. No one wanted to be seen as standing with a disgraced captain and a collapsing command staff. Meanwhile, in precinct break rooms and locker rooms, officers whispered about their own records, wondering who was next. Some pulled their personnel files, searching for complaints they'd forgotten. Others contacted attorneys, preparing for subpoenas that had yet to arrive. The shield of silence that had once protected them cracked wide open. And in homes across the city, victims who had long believed their voices didn't matter began to hope just a little. Families who had settled wrongful arrest cases, activists who had been mocked for protesting, and ordinary citizens who had once feared retaliation now saw that maybe, just maybe, the system could be forced to listen. At the heart of it all, Judge Rebecca Washington stood as the storm's quiet center. She gave no victory speeches. She didn't celebrate Sullivan's collapse. She returned to her chambers and continued presiding over the racketeering trial she had started before the assault. But when asked by reporters what this moment meant, she gave a single, powerful answer. This is not the end. This is the beginning of the work we should have been doing all along. Civil rights leaders gathered behind her. Reverend Daniel Price announced a citywide rally for accountability, bringing together faith leaders, youth organizers, and victims' families. National figures like Angela Davis and Brian Stevenson issued statements of support, reminding the public that true change requires vigilance, not just headlines. And on the federal level, the Department of Justice expanded its investigation scope. What began with Sullivan and Foster now stretched to include procurement fraud in police equipment contracts, falsified training certifications, and political contributions made by city officials who had turned a blind eye to misconduct for years. The corruption web wasn't confined to one man. It stretched across institutions, contracts, elections, and courts. And for the first time in a generation, the entire network was under federal scrutiny. Sullivan, meanwhile, faced a reality he had never imagined. Alone in a rented apartment, cut off from his family, banned from law enforcement, and facing decades in prison, he was no longer the man who barked orders across a parking lot. He was just another defendant awaiting trial. When his court-appointed attorney visited him that afternoon, the gravity of his situation finally broke through. "They've got everything, Derek," the attorney said quietly. "The cameras, the case files, the witness statements. If you fight this, you're looking at 15 to 20 years, minimum." Sullivan lowered his head. The man who once commanded an entire department now couldn't even control his own fate. But the greatest blow wasn't the charges. It was the realization that no one was coming to save him. Morrison, too, faced his reckoning. Federal agents searched his home and office, seizing records that detailed years of cover-ups and secret payouts. Foster was indicted alongside Sullivan, accused of orchestrating internal affairs cover-ups in exchange for promotions and political favors. Together, they stood at the center of a conspiracy that betrayed not only their oaths, but every citizen they were sworn to protect. And as the federal indictments became public, one truth became clear. This wasn't the story of a bad cop. This was the story of a system that believed it would never be held accountable. And in the streets of Atlanta, the people made a promise to themselves and to each other. Never again. As the federal investigation deepened, one final name emerged from the shadows. A figure who had remained untouched by previous scandals, whose quiet influence had protected Sullivan, Foster, and Morrison for years. Chief of Police Robert Hayes. For over a decade, Hayes had presented himself as the department's reform-minded leader, speaking at community forums and promising transparency. But behind the curtain, he was the architect of the system that allowed Sullivan's brutality to thrive. He didn't get his hands dirty, but he built the wall that protected those who did. Federal agents followed the money first. Campaign donations routed through law enforcement unions, personal favors traded for political cover, and off-the-books payments to city council members who kept oversight committees weak and toothless. Hayes hadn't needed to order cover-ups directly. He created an environment where misconduct was normalized, where anyone who spoke out found themselves demoted, reassigned, or driven out of the department. Special Agent Walsh stared at the evidence, her jaw tight. He's the one who tied it all together. Morrison and Foster carried it out. Sullivan enforced it. But Hayes built it. Walsh prepared the next round of subpoenas. The charges against Hayes would be the most severe yet. Conspiracy under 18 USS 371, obstruction of justice, and racketeering under the federal RICO statute. It was rare for a sitting police chief to face federal racketeering charges. But Hayes wasn't just a negligent leader, he was the puppet master. Back in his office, Hayes sensed the walls closing in. The morning paper ran a headline he couldn't ignore. Federal investigation expands to Chief Hayes' office. He called his legal counsel, his voice cold and clipped. How bad is it? The answer was brutal. They'd got emails, phone logs, and financial transfers linking you to suppressed investigations. They're naming you as the architect of a pattern and practice conspiracy. Hayes sank into his chair, his fingers steepled beneath his chin. He thought he could survive this storm like everyone before it. But for the first time in his career, he realized there was no backroom deal, no political favor, no friendly prosecutor who could stop what was coming. He had underestimated one person, Judge Rebecca Washington. She had the one thing Hayes could never control, the federal government's full attention. And this time, they were listening. Federal agents wasted no time. By noon, they executed a search warrant on Hayes' office. The sight was surreal. Agents in tactical vests walking past framed commendations and plaques, collecting evidence from the desk of the man who once represented law and order in Atlanta. They found what they needed in the hidden folders on his encrypted laptop, a decade of correspondence mapping the flow of cover-ups. Messages to Morrison, outlining how to handle excessive force complaints before they reached the media. Instructions to Foster on closing internal affairs investigations, quietly, financial spreadsheets showing how the department used discretionary funds to pay off victims without triggering public records requests. At the same time, the Department of Justice filed a motion under the federal RICO statute, alleging that Hayes, Sullivan, Morrison, and Foster had operated a criminal enterprise within the Atlanta Police Department. Racketeering charges weren't just about isolated crimes, they were about a system built for corruption. The fallout was immediate. City council members scrambled to distance themselves. Several who had accepted campaign donations from the police union resigned before they could be named in subpoenas. The mayor's office, blindsided by the scale of the corruption, held a press conference that evening. Mayor Patricia Johnson, Her voice, strained but resolute, announced, "Effective immediately, Chief Robert Hayes is placed on administrative leave, pending the outcome of the federal investigation. Atlanta's residents deserve a police department that serves them, not one that protects itself at their expense." But it was too late to protect the city's reputation. News outlets ran with the story relentlessly. CNN called it a house of cards collapsing from within. The Washington Post described it as the most significant federal intervention in a Southern police department in decades. And in neighborhoods across Atlanta, people watched with a complicated mix of vindication and sadness. For years, they had filed complaints, staged protests, and demanded accountability, only to be told they were imagining things. Now the truth was undeniable. Reverend Daniel Price spoke to a crowd gathered outside City Hall, his voice steady in the cool evening air. "Inuwa corruption ran deep, but now we know how deep, and we will not stop until the entire system is rebuilt from the ground up." The crowd erupted in applause, their voices rising in chants that echoed down the marble steps. No more silence, no more fear, no more hiding behind a badge. And somewhere inside his darkened office, Robert Hayes sat alone, staring at the warrant spread across his desk, realizing that the empire he built was now evidence in a federal criminal case. The following morning, Chief Hayes was escorted out of his home in handcuffs. Cameras caught every step as federal agents led him down his front walk, past the neatly trimmed hedges and polished front door that once symbolized his public image. His neighbors watched in stunned silence, phones raised, capturing the fall of a man who had once been untouchable. Inside the federal courthouse, the charges against him were read aloud: conspiracy to violate civil rights, obstruction of justice, racketeering, abuse of power under color of law. The list went on and on, each charge painting a picture of a man who had weaponized his office not for public safety, but for personal power. Judge Rebecca Washington sat in the gallery that day, her presence a silent reminder of how far the city had fallen and how far it still had to go. She didn't smile. There was no joy in this, just resolve. Assistant U.S. Attorney Michael Torres addressed the press outside the courthouse. "Today's charges send a clear message. No badge, no rank, no title will shield you from accountability. Not in this city, not anymore." But as the headlines spread across the country, federal investigators continued working behind the scenes. The DOJ's pattern and practice investigation expanded to every corner of the Atlanta Police Department. Hiring practices, use of force training, disciplinary records, and financial audits were torn apart, line by line. And the damage wasn't limited to the police force. Several city council members who had accepted illegal campaign contributions from the police union were subpoenaed. Prosecutors who had refused to press charges against officers with repeated misconduct complaints faced ethics investigations. Even members of the Civilian Oversight Board were removed when evidence showed they had conspired to bury reports critical of the department. The systemic rot was deeper than anyone imagined. But out of that collapse, something new began to rise. Civil rights leaders, clergy members, and youth organizers came together to draft a new vision for policing in Atlanta. They proposed independent oversight with subpoena power, mandatory racial bias and constitutional law training, transparent complaint tracking systems, and community-led hiring panels for police leadership positions. And this time, they had the power of the federal government behind them. The Department of Justice appointed a federal monitor to oversee the department's reforms. A multi-year consent decree was drafted, forcing the city to comply with sweeping changes or face crippling financial penalties. For the first time in a generation, Atlanta's police department was being rebuilt, not to protect itself, but to protect its people. And as for Sullivan, Morrison, Foster, and Hayes, their trials were yet to come, but their legacies were already sealed. Once the architects of power, they now stood as examples of what happens when power corrupts absolutely. In a quiet moment, Judge Washington stood alone in the federal courthouse parking lot, where it all began. The night air was cool against her face. She looked at the place where arrogance tried to silence her dignity and failed. She knew the work wasn't finished. But for the first time in years, she could feel something shifting in the city she loved. And this time, it was a shift toward justice. The courtroom was silent as Derek Sullivan stood to face his sentencing. The weight of 2 decades of arrogance pressed down on his shoulders as Federal Judge Thomas Bradley read the charges, aloud, each one cutting deeper than the last. Sullivan had pleaded guilty, hoping for mercy, but there was no saving what he had destroyed. "Captain Sullivan," Judge Bradley began, his voice steady and cold, "you have pled guilty to conspiracy to violate civil rights, deprivation of rights under color of law, obstruction of justice, and violations of the federal hate crime statute. These are not technicalities. These are betrayals of your oath, your badge, and the very Constitution you swore to uphold." Sullivan stared at the floor, unable to meet the judge's gaze. In the gallery, victims of his abuse sat shoulder to shoulder, black men and women, teenagers once falsely arrested, families who had lost loved ones to his unchecked violence. Judge Rebecca Washington sat among them, silent but present, her calm presence reminder that justice, once denied, had finally arrived. "The Department of Justice has recommended a sentence of 15 years in federal prison," Judge Bradley continued. "However, in recognition of your guilty plea and your cooperation with investigators in exposing your co-conspirators, this court will impose a sentence of 12 years in federal custody." The words landed like a hammer. "You will forfeit all personal assets acquired during your tenure that are linked to this criminal enterprise. This includes your pension, your home, and any funds tied to corruption. Furthermore, you are permanently barred from holding any position in law enforcement, public safety, or municipal government for the remainder of your life." The courtroom remained still. Sullivan closed his eyes briefly. 12 years, stripped of his pension, his family gone, his name forever tied to corruption and betrayal. He wasn't just losing his freedom, he was losing his identity. Judge Bradley's voice softened only slightly as he delivered the final blow. "You believed your power was absolute. You believed your authority could silence truth. But the Constitution you swore to uphold is not yours to twist. It belongs to the people, and today it speaks for them." The gavel fell, sharp and final. Federal marshals approached, securing Sullivan's hands behind his back. For the first time in 20 years, he left a courtroom not as a police captain, but as a prisoner. As he was led away, his eyes briefly met Judge Washington's. She didn't look at him with hatred, only disappointment. But Sullivan was not the only one facing the reckoning that day. The courtroom turned its attention to Lieutenant Michael Foster and Lieutenant Commander James Morrison, seated only feet apart but worlds away from the careers they once knew. Federal prosecutors laid out their crimes with surgical precision. Foster, the man who had quietly closed hundreds of internal affairs complaints, was exposed as the protector of corruption. For years, he'd manipulated investigations, falsified reports, and intimidated whistleblowers, all to shield Sullivan and their network from scrutiny. Morrison, the supposed stabilizing hand of the department, had been no better. He authorized hush money settlements to keep victims quiet, lobbied city council members to block oversight measures, and instructed subordinates to prioritize the department's image over accountability. When asked by the judge if they had anything to say before sentencing, both men struggled for words. Foster spoke first, his voice hoarse. "I thought I was protecting the department, but I was only protecting myself. And I failed everyone we were sworn to serve." Morrison followed, his voice low and resigned. "I thought I could control it. I thought I could keep it from spiraling, but I became part of the very rot I was supposed to prevent." Judge Bradley listened without sympathy. "Your failures did not occur in a vacuum," he said, his tone sharp. "They occurred in a city where trust in law enforcement was already fragile, where communities lived in fear of the very officers sworn to protect them. You amplified that fear. You corrupted that trust." The sentences were swift. Lieutenant Foster received 10 years in federal prison, along with permanent disqualification from public service and the forfeiture of his pension. Lieutenant Commander Morrison received 8 years in federal custody, with similar forfeitures and a lifetime ban from government employment. Both men would serve their sentences in separate federal facilities, far from the city they had once controlled. The department they left behind was a shell of its former self. Federal oversight, already in motion, would last a minimum of 5 years under the terms of the DOJ consent decree. Every use of force report, every hiring decision, every disciplinary action would be reviewed by a federal monitor. Body cameras would become mandatory. Citizen complaint boards would be given real authority. For the officers still wearing the badge, the message was clear. The era of impunity was over. Outside the courthouse, community leaders addressed the crowd gathered on the steps. Reverend Daniel Price spoke first, his voice steady but weary. "This isn't the end of our struggle," he said, "but it's the first time in a long time that the system has looked back at us and acknowledged our pain, and that matters." Judge Washington, when approached by reporters, offered only this: "The law worked today, but now we must rebuild what their corruption destroyed." The city was wounded, but it was no longer blind. And for the first time in decades, the people of Atlanta believed the system might finally belong to them again. Weeks later, far from the courtroom and far from the streets of Atlanta, Derek Sullivan sat alone in a federal prison cell. The white walls were bare, the steel bed frame cold against his back. Gone were the accolades, the radio chatter, the shouts of subordinates waiting for orders. In this place, there were no followers, no admirers, just one man, finally forced to sit with the weight of his choices. He replayed the courtroom over and over in his mind, unable to escape the echo of Judge Bradley's words. 12 years, stripped of his pension, disgraced in the eyes of his family and the public. Everything he had built was gone, and for the first time, he had no one to blame but himself. Letters from his wife went unanswered, not because she hadn't written, but because she hadn't sent a single word since filing for divorce. His children, once so proud to wear his badge number on t-shirts during community picnics, had erased his name from their lives. They had become strangers. And yet, in his darkest moments, what haunted Sullivan most wasn't the prison bars. It was the memory of Judge Washington's eyes, calm and steady, refusing to meet his hatred with hatred. She had stood where he thought no one could stand, and he had fallen where he thought no one could touch him. Meanwhile, beyond the prison walls, the Federal Oversight Committee was hard at work, led by Special Agent Walsh and monitored by the Department of Justice. The Atlantic Police Department was being rebuilt from the ground up. Officers underwent mandatory civil rights training, community head hiring panels began vetting leadership, and for the first time, a civilian review board had the authority to recommend disciplinary action against senior command. The reforms weren't perfect. Mistakes were made. Resistance remained. But progress was visible. In the neighborhoods that Sullivan once terrorized, fewer complaints were filed. Officers who once ignored accountability now had body cameras recording every step. And in community centers, children who once feared the badge began to imagine futures where they wore it for the right reasons. For Lieutenant Foster and Commander Morrison, life in prison was a quieter collapse. Foster spent his days in a prison library, poring over legal textbooks he once manipulated to protect his friends. Morrison kept to himself, working in the kitchen, avoiding eye contact with inmates who knew exactly why he was there. Their legacies were erased from department records, their commendations revoked, their portraits removed from the precinct walls. But perhaps the most lasting change came from the city itself. A year after the trials, Atlanta held its first Citizens Police Accountability Forum. Hundreds gathered to share stories, propose new policies, and vote on department leadership recommendations. And seated quietly in the back of that meeting hall was Judge Washington. She didn't speak first. She listened to voices the system once ignored, to families who had waited too long to be heard. When she finally rose to speak, the room fell silent. "Justice," she said softly, "is not a destination, it is a practice, and every one of us here is responsible for keeping it alive." The crowd rose in quiet applause, not because they believed the fight was over, but because they finally believed it had begun in earnest. Back in his cell, Sullivan read the headlines on an old newspaper discarded in the prison common area. Neoga Police Department 1 year into federal oversight. Community Trust, Friday. He folded the paper slowly, his hands trembling with regret. This was his legacy. Not the medals, not the rank, but the reminder that unchecked power will always fall. And when it does, the people it tried to silence will write the next chapter. 1 year later, the changes were impossible to ignore. The Atlanta Police Department, once a fortress of secrecy and arrogance, had become something no one could have predicted, a national model of accountability. Judge Rebecca Washington stood at the center of a press conference in front of the newly renovated Public Safety Center. Her voice steady but humble, as she addressed a sea of reporters and community members. In the past 12 months, excessive force complaints have dropped by over 60%, she announced. Community trust has risen to its highest levels in 20 years, and for the first time in our city's history, citizens, not just politicians or police brass, have a real voice in law enforcement oversight. Behind her stood new leadership, officers promoted not by favoritism, but by their commitment to constitutional policing. Civilian Review Board members, formerly sidelined, now held key decision-making authority in hiring, training, and disciplinary actions. The reforms weren't cosmetic, they were structural. Mandatory racial bias training became a prerequisite for every new recruit. Body cameras were not only worn but regularly audited, and whistleblowers who had once been punished were now protected by new state and federal laws championed in the wake of the investigation. But Judge Washington knew the work was far from finished. Federal monitors would remain for another 4 years, ensuring compliance and progress. And even after they left, it would be up to the people of Atlanta to protect the changes they had fought for. Still, for the first time in her career, she saw something she had once feared impossible. A department where the culture of silence was breaking apart, replaced by a quiet but growing culture of service. Civil rights leaders from across the country visited Atlanta to learn how the city had turned crisis into reform. Police departments in Chicago, Baltimore, and New Orleans requested copies of Atlanta's consent decree and reform protocols, hoping to replicate the progress. And in neighborhoods that had once lived in fear of a flashing badge, something remarkable happened. Children waved at patrol cars without shrinking back. Elders walked home from church without looking over their shoulders, and families gathered in parks without wondering if they would make it home safely. It wasn't perfect, but it was better. And in that fragile but powerful change, Judge Washington saw the true measure of justice. Not in the fall of men like Sullivan, but in the rise of communities they had once tried to silence. One evening, long after the reporters had packed up their cameras and the crowd had faded into the night, Judge Rebecca Washington found herself walking alone past the same federal courthouse parking lot where it had all begun. The night air was cool and quiet, so different from that humid, chaotic evening when arrogance met resistance and history took an unexpected turn. She paused near the place where her briefcase had fallen, where her dignity had been challenged, but never broken. The asphalt was still cracked in places. The streetlights hummed softly overhead. She stood there, not as a victim, but as a survivor, and as a catalyst for something far greater than personal vindication. Her thoughts wandered back to that night. She remembered the look in Sullivan's eyes, blind rage, fueled by prejudice and unchecked power. She remembered the stunned silence of his officers, the hesitant steps of Torres, the first to recognize that something irreversible was happening. But most of all, she remembered her own voice, calm, clear, steady, speaking the truth of the law, even as hands tried to silence her. And in that quiet moment, she felt no bitterness, only gratitude. Gratitude for the training that had prepared her for that moment, for the mentors who had taught her to stand firm in the face of injustice, and for the ancestors who had walked far more dangerous roads, paving the way for her to stand in that parking lot with her head held high. Behind her, the federal courthouse lights glowed softly, casting long shadows across the pavement. Shadows that once concealed injustice, now illuminated by the harsh, unrelenting light of accountability. She took a deep breath and smiled, not for what she had endured, but for what had changed. Because Atlanta was not the same city it had been a year ago, and neither was she. Her walk home was quiet, but her mind was clear. The fight for justice would never be over. But for once, it felt like they had won a battle worth remembering. And as she reached the corner of the street, she heard a voice behind her. "Evening, Judge." She turned to see a young officer, new uniform, respectful tone, and eyes that didn't carry the weight of arrogance, but of service. "Evening, officer," she replied softly, the words carrying a warmth that surprised even her. It was just a moment, but it was enough. Enough to remind her that change wasn't measured in headlines. It was measured in nights like this, quiet, unbroken, free. And for the first time in a long time, she walked home without looking back. Across the country, the story of what happened in Atlanta became a case study. Law schools taught it as an example of what happens when unchecked power collides with an unbreakable sense of justice. Police academies used it to warn young recruits about the cost of arrogance and the danger of silence. And for communities long silenced by abuse, it became something else. Proof. Proof that even when the system seems deaf to your cries, even when power seems untouchable, truth can break through. Months later, in a speech before the Federal Advisory Committee on Police Reform, Judge Washington spoke to an audience of lawmakers, police chiefs, and civil rights leaders. Her words were measured but powerful. Derek Sullivan thought he was teaching a lesson in obedience. He thought his badge gave him the final word on power. But what he failed to understand is that power without accountability is not justice. It is tyranny. And in the end, tyranny always falls. Her words rippled across the room and beyond it. Because what had happened in that parking lot wasn't just an isolated mistake. It was the flashpoint of a system finally exposed. And, in its place, something new was beginning to take shape. The Department of Justice extended its reforms to other cities facing similar crises. New legislation passed requiring federal oversight in departments with repeated civil rights violations. Across America, ordinary citizens, activists, clergy, teachers, and families began demanding what Atlanta had finally proven was possible: transparency, accountability, dignity. And in the quiet corners of Atlanta, where mothers once warned their children to avoid eye contact with passing cruisers, there was a slow, steady shift. A shift in how officers approached a routine stop. A shift in how citizens demanded to be treated. A shift in what was no longer acceptable because one woman refused to be silent. But while the world moved forward, in a federal prison hundreds of miles away, Derek Sullivan sat alone in his cell. His uniform gone, his title stripped, his reputation shattered. He once thought his authority would last forever, that his badge would protect him from consequences. But now, he was just another inmate. Another man forced to confront the truth he spent his life denying. And every night, as the lights dimmed and the silence returned, he thought about that parking lot. About the moment when power failed, and when justice spoke louder. In the end, this story was never about one officer or one judge. It was about a system built by people, protected by silence, and finally broken by courage. And it leaves us with a question we must all answer. Who do we become when no one is watching? Because justice doesn't wait for the cameras. It lives in the moments when we choose what is right, even when it costs us everything. And it endures in the quiet footsteps of those who carry the weight of doing what is right, even when it's dangerous, even when it's lonely, even when it feels impossible. That is the legacy Judge Rebecca Washington left behind. A warning and a hope that in America, no one, absolutely no one, is above the law.